She stood in the doorway one quiet evening, her hands trembling as the last echo of his angry words faded into silence. And in that stillness, something inside her finally broke. For 10 long years, she had given everything, her love, her trust, her youth, to a man who once promised forever, only to discover that forever can end with a single lie. That night, while their 2 little children slept in the next room, she packed a small bag, tears slipping down her cheeks, not because she was weak, but because she was finally strong enough to walk away. The air felt heavy, her heart felt hollow, but she knew deep inside this pain was her only chance to survive. For years she had ignored the late-night messages, the sudden business trips, the cold distance that grew between them like a wall no one could climb. She kept believing that love could fix everything, that patience, silence, and sacrifice would one day bring him back. But love, she learned, cannot save someone who doesn't want to be saved. When she finally discovered the truth, another woman, another life he had built behind her back, her world didn't explode. It quietly collapsed, like a candle burning out after too many lonely nights. She didn't scream, she didn't beg, she didn't curse his name. She simply looked at him with tired eyes, the kind that no longer hoped for apologies, and whispered, "I wish you happiness." Those were her last words before she closed the door behind her and stepped into a future she couldn't see yet, holding the hands of her 2 children, promising herself she would never let them feel unloved. The small apartment she moved into was old and cold, the paint peeling, the rent barely affordable, but every corner carried peace, a peace she hadn't felt in years. She worked long hours, juggling 2 part-time jobs, often coming home after midnight, exhausted but grateful, because every plate of food she placed before her children was earned through her own hands. Nights were hard. Loneliness would whisper her name. Memories would haunt her dreams, but she would wake up, wipe her tears, and remind herself that walking away was not a failure. It was survival. She never told her children the full truth. They were too young, too innocent to understand betrayal. She only told them their father loved them, even if he wasn't around, because she refused to let his choices poison their hearts. And though she carried a storm inside, she wore a calm smile every morning, because she wanted her children to remember her as strong, not broken. In those first few months, there were days she questioned everything. If she had done enough, if love was ever real, if leaving was the right choice. But each time she saw her children sleeping peacefully beside her, she knew she had chosen freedom over fear. What she didn't know was that the same man who once made her feel invisible would one day come back, desperate to be seen. Months passed, and life slowly began to settle into a rhythm, simple, quiet, honest. Every morning, she walked her children to school, kissed their foreheads, and whispered small promises of better days. Though money was tight, she found joy in little things, their laughter, their drawings on the wall, the warmth of sunlight spilling through cracked windows. Sometimes, when she saw couples walking hand in hand, a faint ache rose in her chest, but she never let it stay long. She had no room left for regret. What she didn't expect, however, was how quickly the world would remind her of the man she left behind. One evening, as she returned from work, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. She hesitated, opened it, and her breath caught. It was him. "Can we talk?" The message read. Her heart raced, not from love, but from the old familiar fear she thought she'd buried. She stared at the screen for a long time, then turned it off. She had nothing left to say. But days later, when she went to her children's school for a parent meeting, she overheard whispers. Her ex-husband had been seen with another woman, one younger, glamorous, full of laughter. A small part of her felt relieved. Maybe now he'd leave her alone. Yet life has a strange way of circling back to unfinished lessons. Late one night, as she tucked her children into bed, her daughter asked softly, "Mom, why doesn't Daddy visit us anymore?" The question pierced her heart. She wanted to say, "Because he chose someone else." But instead she smiled and whispered, "Sometimes grown-ups need time to understand what really matters." And with that, she kissed her goodnight, hiding the pain behind a calm voice. But the truth was, he had changed numbers, changed homes, changed everything, and never once looked back. Until one afternoon, a friend from her old neighborhood called to say she'd seen him at the hospital, pacing nervously outside the emergency room. There was talk that his new partner had left him, taking everything with her. For a brief moment, She felt a flicker of pity, not because she still loved him, but because she knew what it was like to be broken by someone you trusted. Yet she shook the thought away. He had made his choices, and she had learned hers. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if karma truly existed, and deep down, a quiet voice whispered that perhaps it does. She didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning, because the man who once betrayed her would soon reappear in her life, and this time it would be him on his knees, asking for forgiveness she no longer had to give. Weeks turned into months, and her life, though quiet and modest, began to bloom in unexpected ways. She found a better job at a small local shop, where her kindness drew customers and her smile became a familiar comfort. For the first time in years, she laughed without fear, cooked without tension, and slept without waiting for footsteps that never came. Her children grew brighter, happier, and though they missed their father, they slowly learned to live without his promises. One Sunday afternoon, as she walked them home from the park, a familiar voice stopped her cold. "It's been a long time," he said, his tone softer than she remembered. She turned, and there he was, thinner, older, eyes clouded with regret. Her heart didn't race this time. It stayed steady, calm, distant. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. But he only smiled weakly and said, "I needed to see you." For a long moment they stood there, strangers who once shared everything. He looked at the children, their faces full of curiosity, and his voice cracked as he said, "You've done a good job." She wanted to walk away, to protect her peace, but curiosity held her still. Later that evening, she found a letter slipped under her door. It was from him. The words were messy, desperate. He spoke of loneliness, of mistakes, of nights spent drinking and calling her name in silence. He said the woman he left her for had drained him of everything, money, trust, even dignity. And when she was gone, he realized the only real thing he ever had was the family he betrayed. For a moment, she felt old wounds stirring, but then she remembered every tear she cried alone, every meal she ate in silence, every birthday he missed. She folded the letter and placed it in a drawer she rarely opened, where forgotten things belonged. Days later he came again, this time waiting outside her work, his eyes pleading. "I just want to talk," he said. "Please." She hesitated, torn between anger and pity. Against her better judgment, she agreed to meet him in a nearby cafe. Sitting across from him, she barely recognized the man she once loved. His voice trembled as he admitted everything. How his pride blinded him, how he chased pleasure and lost peace, how he realized too late that love is not something you replace. She listened quietly, her face calm but her heart aching, not from love but from the weight of memories. "I don't hate you," she finally said, "but I don't know you anymore." His eyes filled with tears, but before he could speak, she stood and walked out, leaving him staring at the empty chair. That night, as she watched her children sleep, she wondered if closure always had to hurt, or if some wounds simply fade when you stop touching them. Yet a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was not the end, but the start of something unexpected, something that would test everything she had built from the ashes of her past. In the following weeks, she tried to push the encounter out of her mind, to return to her peaceful routine. But life has a way of bringing unfinished stories back to your door. One evening, as she was helping her son with homework, a knock echoed through the small apartment. When she opened the door, she froze. He stood there again, but this time he wasn't alone. Behind him was an older woman, frail, holding onto his arm for balance. "This is my mother," he said softly, eyes downcast. The woman gave a weak smile and said, "I wanted to see my grandchildren." "Just once." Her voice trembled with age, and for a moment all the anger melted from her heart. She stepped aside and let them in. The children, unsure at first, slowly warmed up, asking innocent questions and showing their drawings. The old woman's eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "You've raised them beautifully. For the first time, the home that once knew only silence carried echoes of laughter again. But behind it lingered something fragile, something unspoken." After they left, she sat by the window, staring into the night, wondering why it hurt to see kindness from the same family that once turned away. Days later, she received another letter, this time from his mother. In it, the old woman apologized for not believing her all those years ago, for siding with her son, for calling her ungrateful when she stayed silent through betrayal. "I see now," the letter said, "that strength is not in holding on, but in knowing when to walk away." Tears blurred her eyes as she read, realizing that sometimes closure comes not from the one who hurt you, but from those who finally see the truth. Yet even as she found some peace, another storm was brewing. Her ex-husband began showing up more often, waiting outside the school, leaving small gifts, sending messages that grew more desperate by the day. "I'm not the same man," he wrote. "I've lost everything, but I'm ready to start again." She wanted to believe that people could change, but she also knew that regret is not the same as transformation. One evening, he confessed that he was deep in debt, jobless, and alone. "I don't need your money," he said. "I just need your forgiveness." His voice cracked, and for the first time, she saw not a villain, but a man broken by his own choices. Still, she kept her distance, not out of hate, but out of wisdom. Forgiveness, she knew, didn't always mean reconciliation. Yet destiny had one more test waiting. Weeks later, she received a call from the hospital. He had been admitted after collapsing at work. Something inside her shifted. Despite everything, she couldn't ignore the years they shared, the memories that once felt like life itself. When she arrived, she saw him lying weak, eyes closed, breathing shallow. And in that fragile moment, she realized that life has strange ways of teaching love, sometimes through pain, sometimes through loss. She sat beside his bed, not as his wife, not as the woman he betrayed, but as a human being who understood that compassion is not weakness. As she held his hand, he opened his eyes and whispered, "I never deserved you." She didn't reply. Some truths are too heavy for words. What she didn't know was that this visit would change everything, revealing secrets that would make her question everything she thought she knew about their past. After that night at the hospital, something inside her began to stir. Not love, not attachment, but a quiet sadness for the man he had become. He looked fragile, almost like a shadow of the person she once knew. In his eyes, she saw regret, not only for losing her, but for losing himself along the way. Over the next few weeks, she visited occasionally, bringing small things he needed: a blanket, a home-cooked meal, sometimes just silence. They spoke little, but each visit peeled back another layer of their shared past. One evening, as rain poured outside the hospital window, he gathered the courage to speak. "There's something you don't know," he said weakly, staring at the ceiling. "The woman I left you for, she wasn't just another mistake. She was someone I thought could give me everything I didn't have. But the truth is, I destroyed myself chasing a life that never existed." His voice trembled as he continued. "When she left, I found letters you wrote years ago, the ones I never opened. You begged me to talk, to see what was happening between us. I ignored them. I thought silence would make you stay." Tears rolled down her cheeks as she whispered, "You chose pride over love." He nodded, guilt heavy in his eyes. "And I've paid for it every day since." In that moment, she realized that time doesn't always heal. Sometimes it only teaches. She left the hospital that night feeling both lighter and heavier, torn between forgiveness and finality. Days later, his mother called. His condition was worsening. Without thinking, she rushed back. When she entered the room, he smiled faintly and said, "I don't deserve your kindness, but I need to tell you one last truth." Her heart pounded as he whispered, "The night you left, I wasn't angry because you found out. I was angry because I knew you'd never come back. You were the only real thing I ever had." She took his hand, her tears falling freely now. "I did love you," she said softly. "But sometimes love isn't enough." His eyes closed slowly, and for a moment, she thought he was gone. But then he whispered, "Thank you for not hating me." The silence that followed was long and heavy. She sat there for hours, watching the man who once shattered her heart now fading before her eyes. It wasn't revenge she felt, it was release. The pain, the anger, the years of silence, they all dissolved into something simpler, something purer, compassion. Days later, when he finally passed away, she didn't cry in the way she thought she would. Instead, she stood by his grave quietly, holding her children's hands, and whispered, "May your soul find peace." Yet even in death, his shadow lingered, not as a curse but as a reminder of how far she had come. People in the town began whispering about her strength, how she forgave the man who betrayed her, how she chose peace over pride. But deep down she knew the truth. Forgiveness was never for him. It was for herself. What she didn't expect, however, was the letter he had left behind. One final message that would change how she remembered everything. A week after the funeral, she received a call from the hospital asking her to collect a small envelope he had left for her. She hesitated at first. Part of her wanted to leave the past buried, but something in her heart told her to go. When she opened the envelope at home, her hands trembled. Inside was a short letter, written in shaky handwriting, along with a folded photograph of their family from years ago. The letter began simply, "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I don't know if I deserve your eyes on these words, but I need to tell you the truth before it's too late." He confessed things she never knew. How, even during his betrayal, there were nights he came home and stood by the door, listening to their children breathe, wanting to come back but too ashamed to face her forgiveness. He admitted that the woman he left her for had manipulated him, feeding his ego, convincing him that he was missing out on life, and by the time he realized her love was real and unconditional, it was too late. "You were my home," he wrote, "and I destroyed it with my own hands." In the final lines, his words softened. "If I could live again, I'd spend every lifetime proving that love like yours exists. I hope you never carry the weight of what I did. Let me go and live free." As tears fell onto the paper, she smiled faintly, not from joy but from understanding. Pain, she realized, had turned her into someone stronger than she ever thought she could be. She placed the letter in a small wooden box along with the photograph, whispering, "I forgive you." From that day on, something shifted in her soul. The anger that once chained her heart slowly disappeared, replaced by quiet gratitude for the lessons learned. Her children grew up watching their mother not as a victim, but as a warrior, a woman who rebuilt her world with gentleness, not bitterness. Years later, when they asked about their father, she told them the truth, but with kindness, that he was a man who made mistakes, but also a man who learned too late what love truly means. And when they asked her if she ever regretted walking away, she smiled softly and said, "Sometimes leaving is not the end of love. It's the beginning of self-respect." Life eventually rewarded her strength. She built a small business, surrounded herself with good people, and learned to smile again. A real smile, free from fear. Sometimes at night, when the house was silent and the world outside was asleep, she would look at the stars and whisper a silent prayer. Not for what was lost, but for what was found. She had walked away quietly, carrying nothing but 2 children and a heart full of cracks, and now she stood tall, whole, unshaken. Her story was not about betrayal. It was about rebirth. In the end, the greatest revenge against pain is peace, and the truest closure comes not from their apology, but from your own forgiveness. So if you ever find yourself breaking under the weight of someone's lies, remember her story, how she walked away with nothing and built everything again. Sometimes God breaks your heart to save your soul, and sometimes the love you lose is just the lesson you needed to finally love yourself. If you felt her pain, if her journey touched your heart, share her story. Because somewhere, someone needs to hear that walking away is not weakness. It's courage in its purest form. The end.